All right, so what is going on? If you're in the ecom space, you've probably experienced something like this before. You've had a supplier overcharging you. You've had a supplier shipping you products late, costing you money when you run out of inventory. Or you've just had a supplier shipping you terrible quality products or things that aren't even what you ordered, and it's happened on multiple occasions. Most likely, if you're in the ecom space, you've dealt with some extent of supplier issues, I would say most likely before. So this video is going to be designed to help you avoid those supplier issues and give you some insider information, or maybe some trade secrets, if you will, on how to avoid these issues. Now, this is stuff that could honestly, in some cases, I don't know your business, I can't make financial claims, but it could potentially, in my opinion, save you thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of dollars or more, depending on your business. So with that being said, let's get into it. So the first thing we need to know about when we're talking about solving supplier issues is how Alibaba works. So a lot of people who sell stuff online, they source from places like Alibaba. Now, what a lot of people don't know about Alibaba is, I want you to think about this like the best way I can give you an example, right, is, let's say, for example, you got somebody, right, and they're in some shady business, let's call it, right? And so they're selling something that maybe you're not supposed to be selling. We're going to use this as an example. It's the best way I can describe it, right? But how does the distribution chain typically work in a business like that, from what we know, right? Don't condone that. I'm just saying, for the sake of this example, let's just think about this for a second. At the top, what do you have? Typically the boss or the organization or whatever, and when they're selling the stuff, they're going to sell in larger quantities a lot of times, right? And it's going to be a lesser price and probably better quality, right? Let's just, for the sake of this example, right? But now as it exchanges hands and it goes down through the distribution network, the prices start to go up because the people have to make the money along the way. And so a lot of people, they think that when they go on Alibaba, they are dealing direct with the top of the food chain supplier, right? Who's at the very top, actually making the stuff. And in my opinion, from what I've learned, is a lot of times that's not the case. So a lot of times you are dealing with a middleman. You could call them a trading company or a trader, or some people may say a trading arm of the actual company, where, say, for example, you've got this big company, right? They're a big factory. And then you got the trading arm, right? And the trading arm may even have a similar name. So let's say you got Aiden Ecom Factory, right? Just for example, you can use my name. You got Aiden Ecom, the factory, right? And then you got your trading arm, and it's Aiden Ecom Tech or something like that. And you may see that as somebody who maybe isn't trained to be able to spot this stuff or has never experienced it before. You may see that and you may think, well, that's the same company. I looked up Aiden Ecom, and there's a company called Aiden Ecom, and they're reputable and they've got all this information. So that must be them, right? Maybe that's the company that's making the parts, but Aiden Ecom Tech may not be the same company as Aiden Ecom. They may be a company that has a relationship. They're maybe a trading company or a trading arm of that company that has a relationship with that company, where every time you place an order, let's say you got a bottle, right? They go order it for 5 or 6 cents, and they go charge you 25 or 30 cents. And you think you're dealing with a supplier the whole time. It's just a client of that supplier. A lot of people don't know this. And so can Alibaba be a great tool? Yes. You can start selling a product on there. You may be able to find, for example, trading companies where you have lower minimum order quantities with some products, depending on what it is. But my point here is, if you want to deal direct with the supplier, Alibaba may not be your best bet. So that is something you need to know about Alibaba if you're going to get into selling products on ecom, is If your cost of goods is too high, you might ought to look into, if you're sourcing internationally, trying to find the actual factories that you can work directly with, because you may get lower prices and better quality. I'll give you one example. I'm not going to say the name of this person, but I was helping them with some stuff. And I was telling him, years ago, hey, man, your cost of goods is just too high. Here's what I would do, do what you want by all means, but here's what I would do to lower your cost of goods, because it seems like you're just paying too much for this stuff. And he didn't really want to at the time, but long story short, we finally decided to do it, years later, lower his cost of goods. And guess what happens? We were able to find every single one of these, basically the same exact parts that he was paying like 3 to 4 times for in some cases, anywhere from 25 to 30% higher to as much as like 3 or 4 times higher for these various parts from different factories, right? And so he was able to heavily reduce his cost of goods on a lot of these parts simply by just investing a little bit of money to work with a sourcing agent in China. Because if you don't speak Chinese, if you're not on the ground in China, you may need somebody called a sourcing agent to help you find these factories and help you work with these factories and get the quotes and all this. So that's what one of the things about Alibaba suppliers that you might want to know if you're trying to solve these issues. The other thing is, when it comes to quality issues and stuff, another thing you can do, you can hire a third-party inspection company to do a pre-shipment inspection. And oftentimes it's a lot cheaper if they're in China, because the labor costs are so much lower and everything. So that could always be an option, where you get a third-party inspection company to actually go to the factory, and do an inspection before the goods are actually shipped to you and test everything and whatnot. So that's always an option too. But yeah, outside of that, so another thing to know about how these Chinese factories operate is a lot of people, they don't really understand that they operate much differently than factories in the US and suppliers in the US and everything. So when you're in the US, right, and you go on to Google or whatever, and you look for a supplier or you look for a manufacturer, more often than not, if you're able to actually visit that place and go in that place in person, a lot of times you may be working directly with the factory. And it can often be much more expensive in an apples to apples comparison to work with a factory in the US versus overseas, because we have higher labor costs and everything. Now, you can save on shipping if you're not having to deal with international shipping and the tariffs, and you have faster lead times. So there's trade-offs there, but typically your costs are going to be higher in an apples-to-apples comparison with a lot of industries. Now, with Chinese factories, they operate a little differently. So the first thing is, a lot of times, they like to use something called WeChat. So you'll be familiar with WeChat if you are working directly with the factories, where sometimes they may use WhatsApp, or whatever, but a lot of times they use WeChat, and a lot of times the way that they take payments may be different. So some factories may use like WeChat Pay or Alipay. Now, what you need to know about this is, if you're in the US and you're trying to make a payment with something like Alipay, you might be able to do it, but it can be a bit of a hassle, right? There may be ways to get around it and try to make it work properly and stuff, but really using these Chinese apps to make payments can be a hassle if you're in the US. Ignore that. So what do you do instead? There is something called WisePay, which I would recommend using something like WisePay. There's also like Western Union. I believe there's Payoneer, several different things out there. But I would use something like WisePay to make those payments instead, because WisePay, if you have to pay with Alipay, has an integration that you can use. Now, when you use this integration, what you'll want to make sure of is that you are typing in the supplier's name exactly as it is listed on Alipay. Because once again, this comes back to language barrier and miscommunications, which can happen when you're dealing with Chinese suppliers. They may send you the name. You may say, well, what's the name so I can enter this in for the payment, or something like that, right? And then they send you the name and you type it in. You're like, well, why is this not coming up? This isn't working. Well, you may be typing the name in incorrectly based on how it is supposed to be entered in Alipay, right? So you need to enter it in exactly how it is entered in their Alipay system to be able to type that in correctly. So once again, language barrier can be a struggle. One of the tools you can use when you're faced with some of these issues that can be surprisingly helpful is something called ChatGPT. So ask it questions if you're facing issues like this. Ask it to help you translate, help you problem solve some of this stuff. It can be a very helpful tool. So anyways, the next thing, when you're faced with manufacturing issues of any sort, supplier issues, quality issues, pricing issues, a lot of times the answer or the solution to the problems can be very simple, but you make it complicated when you avoid doing the simple thing. A lot of people don't want to do the simple thing. They may have some reason in their head that they don't want to do the simple thing that would make the most sense. Like, hey, I like this supplier. I don't want to switch suppliers. And let's say the quality's bad. It's been going on for a long time. They've had lots of issues with you. They're sending shipments late. Half your lids don't work. Your cups are all scratched up, whatever the case is. By the way, this is based on a real world example. I'm not going to name the guy. I like this guy, but this is a real world example. I went back and forth with him for a long time, and I was like, hey, man, like the quality in these cups is just not good. Like what they're sending you for what you're paying is just not good. They're not doing a good job. They had delays with their shipments. They caused you to run out of stock for Christmas time. I would switch to a good manufacturer. And we went back and forth. Me and this guy went back and forth about this for a while. He had switched from China to the US and then started having all these other issues along with the issues he was having before, which that's a whole different story. But anyways, he was having all these other issues now that he moved to the US on top of the other issues that he was having before. And he wasn't sure what was going on, right? And I was explaining to him, he's like, well, it must just be that all suppliers are bad and no suppliers can do a good job and all this stuff. And I was like, man, that is not true. There's lots of great suppliers out there that do a great job, that really want to do what's right and want to help you succeed in your business. But you have to find those suppliers and you have to make sure you're vetting the people you're working with. And you have to know how to vet them. You can't just go find any supplier and expect them to do a good job, right? You have to take the time to vet the people that you're working with. And so that's one of the secrets about this stuff is you want to take lots of time to make sure very carefully that you are working with the correct person if they're going to be making your product. That's a very important step, right? Make sure that you take a lot of time and effort on that step of the process before you get started so that you don't just go find some random person off the street or go with a referral, for example, of somebody who wasn't doing a good job. Don't do that either. Don't go with the referral of, let's say, a Chinese supplier. If the Chinese supplier was not doing a good job and you're switching to the US, whole host of reasons for that too, right? Anyways, so he had all these issues and I was telling him for the longest time, man, just switch to a new factory, switch to a new factory and I would bet you these issues will go away. Well, guess what happened? We couldn't figure out how to solve this problem without doing that. And as soon as we did the simple thing, we moved the production from this factory over here to this factory over here. Guess what happens? All the issues pretty much vanish. Almost every one of the issues that he was having went away or got significantly better at the new factory. Everything got better. The lead times were better. He was no longer having to wait for machines. And you can clearly see if you were to go into these two factories, which I've done, you can clearly see the night and day difference between the two factories. You can figure out where the problem was just by going into the factory, the first factory that wasn't doing a good job. It was disorganized. Everything was, the people inside the factory looked like they were miserable and they hated everything that they were doing. They're talking about how they want to go home and all this stuff and like complaining about their job to the people they're picking up their parts. That's just kind of like not good. Not a good look if you ask me. The place is just a mess. It was not very professional at all. And this isn't knocking that guy. He may be a great guy that owns the company. I'm just saying, it was clear what the issue was when you go and you look in there versus the other place. First time he goes in to meet with this new factory, he's like, dude, that is insane. It's night and day from the other place. It's like a completely different atmosphere. They're super professional. It's super organized. They're very clean. They've got all this nice equipment. Everything looks super nice. They bought me lunch and all this stuff, and so it's a totally different environment. I go there and the employees at the new factory, which I picked, are happy to be there. They're happy to be at their job. They're wanting to help you. They're like, hey, man, can we help you load this stuff up? When they didn't even really have to, right? These guys wanted to help, right? That's the difference. That's the difference in success and failure when you're dealing with manufacturers. You want a manufacturer that is an A player. You want somebody that is in the big leagues. You don't want somebody who's disorganized, who doesn't really care about your business, who's focused on making a profit or focused on telling you things just to keep your business when their actions are showing otherwise. You see what I'm saying? And so the next thing outside of that, do the simple stuff that makes sense. We had the same kind of issues with another thing inside the business as well. Once again, same thing. All we had to do was switch companies. The issue goes away. So don't overcomplicate this, right? Do the simple stuff that makes the most sense when you're faced with an issue and you can't seem to solve it. The next thing, another great tool, very helpful tool, is something called Import Yeti. Now, this is one way you can even source factories. You can use this tool, Import Yeti, to actually find factories in some cases. If you look at like trading companies or companies in the US that do business with Chinese manufacturers, you can use this tool and you can look up the company names. And sometimes it'll tell you, you don't even have to reach out to these companies. You could look up different ways you could go about doing this. But long story short, if you find companies that, let's say, for example, you got a company in the US, right? And they make some of their stuff overseas and they middleman. You can figure out who those factories are without even having to really contact them by just looking the company name up on something like Import Yeti. Little secret there. This is a trade secret that a lot of people don't talk about. You can use that also to see if, say, for example, a factory has a business connection with somebody else overseas. Like, say, for example, you got a supplier and they give you a referral to this other factory here in the US. You can look up that factory in the US on Import Yeti and you can see how long, in some cases, they may show you a business relationship that's been going on. You see what I'm saying? So it can be a very helpful tool in many different ways. You can look at big companies too that sell D2C products and try to figure out who the factories are. Different ways you can go about doing this if you're trying to source stuff. And that can be a lot more effective of a way to try to figure out suppliers versus just using Alibaba. Different way you could do it. So with that being said, the last thing, I want to keep this video kind of somewhat short. The last thing I'll say is when it comes to payment terms and when it comes to working with suppliers, don't be afraid to try to negotiate. Don't be afraid to ask for net terms. In a lot of cases, this is a very common thing that suppliers will give you where either A, you don't have to necessarily pay in full for them to start production. So in China, for example, what's very common is like 30% down. Some of them do like 50%. 30% is fairly common where you pay 30% of the balance. And then once it's complete and ready to ship, then you may pay the remainder. Or in some cases, you may get net terms. Now, ideally, what you want is net terms if possible, because net terms can help you with your cash flow, right? And a lot of businesses where they mess up is they don't have access to the cash flow that they need, right? Especially smaller businesses. Maybe you don't have the credit to be able to have those, better options or whatever the case is. So a lot of businesses may mess up with their cash flow and they may mismanage their money because they don't know their numbers or whatever the case is. Well, having net terms can help you because the invoice won't be due until when those net terms say it's due. So net 30, for example, you ship the product and then essentially the invoice isn't due until like 30 days after. That can help you a lot when you're placing big orders for the holidays to be able to place bigger orders and have more access to cash flow to scale, for example. So a lot of good suppliers, they may even offer you net terms, especially here in the US. So if you're in the United States, that's a very common thing. Overseas, they may do it in some cases too. It just depends. So anyways, with that being said, if you found this video helpful at all, feel free to drop a like, drop a comment below with your brand name. And I might even just reach out to some of you and do a review of your brand if you drop your brand name below in the comments section. So if you found this helpful, leave a like, subscribe for more, and that will be about it for now.